He mocked Senator J.D. Vance, dismissed the law, and ran his courtroom like his personal fiefdom, until justice caught up with him in the most humiliating way possible. The Cincinnati courtroom was packed, the kind of crowd that made people shift uneasily in their seats. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, carrying the weight of history, but today the air felt electric, as if something was about to snap. At the center of it all sat Judge Robert Calloway, a man whose name carried a reputation, though not the kind most judges would want. Known for his theatrics, for cutting people off mid-sentence, for turning the courtroom into his personal stage. Some called him passionate, others reckless. Today he was particularly impatient, flipping through documents with an audible sigh, barely glancing at the witness stand. And then there was J.D. Vance. The senator sat straight-backed, composed, wearing a dark navy suit pressed to perfection. He wasn't the kind to be easily rattled. He'd faced tougher crowds and sharper words. Still, even he could sense the hostility radiating from the bench. It had started the moment he was called to testify. Judge Calloway barely looked up. "Let's make this quick, Senator. I assume you have something relevant to say." Vance didn't flinch. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began speaking, laying out the facts of the case in a steady, controlled tone. But Calloway wasn't listening. He leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as if waiting for a reason to interrupt. And when Vance made his first key point, the judge pounced. All right, we get it," Calloway scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "You're here to make a speech. I don't need a campaign rally in my courtroom." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. The court reporter hesitated before resuming her typing. Even some of the attorneys shifted in their seats. Vance remained unshaken. He locked eyes with the judge, a hint of a frown appearing, but he didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he continued. But Calloway wasn't done. He exhaled loudly, flipping a page of his notes with exaggerated effort. "Let's move this along before we all die of boredom, shall we?" A few chuckles echoed in the gallery, some from Calloway's usual defenders, others from those who laughed out of discomfort. Vance's lawyer, seated just a few feet away, stiffened. He leaned toward his colleague. "This is a joke. That's not just bias, that's outright contempt." The younger attorney beside him nodded but kept his voice low. "He's doing it on purpose. He wants a reaction." But Vance wasn't giving him one. He simply adjusted his tie, kept his voice even, and continued. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this testimony is important for the integrity of—" "Spare me the lecture, Senator." Calloway cut him off, shaking his head. He let out a dramatic sigh, then leaned forward. His next words were quieter but sharp enough to slice through the entire courtroom. "Let's be real. You're not here for justice. You're here to grandstand. It's what you people do best." The murmurs stopped. It was subtle but unmistakable, the way he said it, the deliberate condescension laced in every syllable. Vance's jaw tensed, but still he didn't react. He simply exhaled slowly through his nose, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. But across the room, his legal team was already moving. Something was about to shift. Judge Calloway was enjoying himself. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the bench, watching J.D. Vance with the kind of smirk that made it clear he didn't respect him. Maybe he never had. But the courtroom wasn't on his side today. The murmurs that followed his last comment weren't ones of approval. People shifted in their seats, a few exchanging looks, uncomfortable, waiting to see what would happen next. Vance, for his part, didn't take the bait. He wasn't here to argue with a man who thrived on confrontation. He straightened his papers, cleared his throat, and kept going. As I was saying, Your Honor, the facts of this case... Calloway groaned, actually groaned. Oh, give it a rest, Senator. He turned to the plaintiff's attorney. Do you really want me to sit through another 5 minutes of this? I thought we were dealing with evidence, not ego. A few gasps rippled through the room. The plaintiff's attorney, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, glanced at Vance before responding. Your Honor, Senator Vance's testimony is relevant to the integrity of this case. Calloway waved a hand. If you say so. He looked back at Vance, his eyes narrowing. But make it quick. My patience for political nonsense is wearing thin. Vance didn't rise to the insult. He simply continued. But the hostility wasn't just verbal anymore. Calloway shifted in his seat, rolling his eyes at nearly every sentence. When Vance mentioned key details about the case, the judge muttered under his breath. At one point, he even scoffed loud enough for the jury to hear. The tension in the room thickened. At the defense table, Vance's lead attorney, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, leaned toward his colleague. This is unreal. He's not even trying to hide it. The younger attorney nodded. Should we file a motion? Not yet, he exhaled, but we're getting close. Across the courtroom, a reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook. She had covered enough trials to know when a judge was stepping out of line, and Calloway was sprinting past the line, straight into misconduct territory. The judge, however, remained unfazed. He thrived in moments like these. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Tell me, Senator, when exactly did you become an expert on constitutional law? Vance met his gaze. I studied law before I entered public service, Your Honor. Oh, right, Calloway said with mock realization. I forgot. Another politician who thinks reading a few books makes him an expert. Silence. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked in this courtroom for over a decade, didn't move. Calloway wasn't just being rude. He was belittling a sitting U.S. senator in a courtroom, on record, in front of a jury. And he didn't care. Vance let a few seconds pass, then leaned slightly forward. His voice was calm, measured. Your Honor, I'd appreciate it if we could focus on the case. Calloway laughed, actually laughed. Oh, that's rich. He looked out at the jury as if they were in on the joke. He wants me to focus. You hear that? No one laughed with him. In fact, the room was eerily still. A shift had taken place. The arrogance that had carried Calloway through so many cases, that had let him dominate the courtroom for years, wasn't working today. But he was too wrapped up in his own ego to notice. He turned back to Vance. Here's my advice, Senator. Stick to politics. Leave the law to people who actually know what they're doing. The tension snapped. A few jurors stiffened. The court reporter hesitated before continuing to type. Vance's legal team didn't even bother whispering now. This is blatant misconduct, one of them muttered. And then, suddenly, quietly, the lead attorney reached for his phone, because Judge Calloway had just crossed the line, and someone was about to make sure he paid for it. J.D. Vance barely blinked. His hands remained folded in front of him, his expression controlled. But something had shifted in his posture. He wasn't just tolerating Judge Calloway's behavior. He was letting it play out, letting the arrogance dig deeper, letting the courtroom see it for what it was. He didn't have to respond. The judge was doing the work for him. Calloway, oblivious to the mounting tension in the room, let out another, exaggerated sigh. "You're really going to sit there and act like you're the expert here? Like your opinion matters more than the law?" He chuckled to himself, flipping through the case file as if bored. "I swear, politicians these days think they can walk into a courtroom and start rewriting the rules." Vance didn't take the bait. "Your Honor, I'm here under subpoena to testify on—" "I don't care what you're here for," Calloway snapped, his voice sharp, condescending. "This courtroom isn't your personal stage, and I'm not here to entertain your political fantasies." A murmur spread through the gallery. This was beyond misconduct. This was personal. Across the room, Vance's lead attorney, Mark Hendricks, didn't move, but his fingers tightened around his pen. He had handled his share of difficult judges, but this was something else. He turned to his co-counsel, lowering his voice. "Is the motion ready?" The younger attorney nodded. "Filed 5 minutes ago." Hendricks gave a slight nod. "Good." The judge thought he had control, but that was about to change. Meanwhile, Calloway was still going. "The way I see it, Senator, you're wasting my time. Everyone's time." "Really?" He let out a short laugh. "And frankly, if I wanted to hear someone recite talking points, I'd turn on cable news." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The jury, once attentive, now looked uncertain, almost wary of the man in the robe. But Calloway still wasn't paying attention. He leaned forward, smirking. "Here's the deal. I'll give you 30 more seconds. That's it. After that, we're moving on to something actually worthwhile." A few attorneys at the defense table looked at each other, some with barely hidden disbelief. The court clerk, a woman who had worked under Calloway for over a decade, swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. 2 men entered, moving with quiet authority. They weren't part of the court staff. They were federal marshals. And the second they stepped into the room, the entire energy shifted. Calloway didn't notice at first. He was too busy reveling in his own moment. "All right, Vance, make it count. 30 seconds. Go." But Vance didn't respond, because he had seen them. The marshals moved purposefully down the aisle, their eyes locked on the bench. Hendricks caught sight of them too, his grip loosening on his pen. Calloway finally noticed the change in atmosphere. His smirk wavered. "What's with the whispering?" He glanced at the attorneys, then at the gallery. "Someone want to let me in on the joke?" Neither marshal said a word. They simply stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from the bench. The taller one, a man with a sharp, no-nonsense expression, reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Judge Robert Calloway. The name hit the air like a gavel, striking wood. Calloway's expression twitched. "Yes?" The marshal took another step forward. "You need to come with us." Silence. A deep, uneasy silence that wrapped around the entire courtroom like a noose. The attorneys at the defense table stiffened. The jury, already wary, looked around, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. The court clerk's hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Calloway blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me?" The marshal didn't blink. "Judge Calloway, you are currently under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice. We have a warrant for your arrest." The smirk vanished. The color drained from Calloway's face so fast it was almost comical. His mouth opened slightly, then shut. He blinked again, as if waiting for someone to tell him this was some sort of mistake. But no one did. The gallery was dead silent, save for the sound of a single pen rolling off the desk of a court clerk and hitting the floor. And for the first time all day, Calloway looked unsure of himself, but the marshals weren't waiting for him to process it. They were already reaching for the cuffs. Judge Calloway's confidence cracked. It wasn't a full collapse, not yet, but the shift was undeniable. His smirk faltered. His fingers tensed against the bench, and for the first time all day, he looked like a man caught off guard. "You must be joking," he scoffed, forcing a chuckle. His voice carried an edge now, not quite steady. He glanced around the room as if expecting someone to step in, to push back against the absurdity of what he was hearing. But no one moved. No one spoke. The marshals didn't blink. "This is a courtroom," Calloway snapped, jabbing a finger toward them. "My courtroom. You don't just barge in here like this." The lead marshal didn't flinch. He simply held up the warrant. "Judge Calloway, this is an active federal investigation. You need to come with us." The tension in the room thickened. The attorneys at the defense table sat frozen, some exchanging wide-eyed glances. The court clerks were still, hands hovering over keyboards, unsure if they should be recording this or pretending it wasn't happening. And then there was J.D. Vance. He remained where he was, his hands still folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the way he sat, calm, collected, as if he had already seen this coming. Calloway's breathing picked up. He clenched the armrest of his chair, shaking his head. No, I don't think so." His voice had an unhinged quality now, like a man desperately trying to reassert control. "I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but I'm in the middle of a trial, and You are no longer in session," the marshal interrupted, his voice even but firm. "You are under arrest." The words hung in the air, suffocating the last remnants of Calloway's arrogance. The gallery was silent. Reporters had their phones out, some recording, others typing furiously. Calloway's gaze darted around, his mind racing for an escape. His eyes landed on the bailiff. "Get these men out of here." The bailiff didn't move. A beat passed. Calloway's face contorted, anger overtaking his shock. That was a command. Still nothing. The bailiff looked almost reluctant to meet his eyes, because everyone knew, everyone had always known, that Calloway wasn't a fair judge, that his rulings leaned too conveniently in favor of certain parties, that his temper could tip cases before the arguments even started. But now, it wasn't just whispered suspicions. Now, it was official. Calloway shot up from his chair, sending his gavel clattering to the desk. "I will not be humiliated like this. Do you understand who I am?" The lead marshal's expression didn't change. He stepped closer, his hand resting near his cuffs. "Judge, I strongly suggest you cooperate." Calloway let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, you suggest? That's cute." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but it was forced now, desperate. "And if I don't?" The marshal didn't hesitate, "and then we take you by force." Another thick silence. Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose, his hands curled into fists at his sides. The arrogance in his posture was still there, but it was cracking beneath the bravado. Something else was creeping in. Panic. He looked out at the gallery again, at the reporters, at the jury, at Vance. still unmoving, still watching. And suddenly, for the first time in his career, Calloway wasn't in control, and the realization hit him like a slap to the face. Judge. Calloway's breath was coming in short bursts now, his face flushed, a stark contrast to the icy silence that had settled over the courtroom. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice lower but no less venomous. "A massive mistake." The lead marshal didn't respond. He simply extended his hand, palm up. "Turn around." Calloway let out a humorless chuckle. "You think I'm just going to comply? That I'm going to let you parade me out of here in cuffs like some criminal?" "You are a criminal," the marshal said, his voice firm now. "Turn around." Calloway's jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the bailiff again, then to the court clerks, to the attorneys, the jury, anyone, someone. He was looking for a lifeline, but no one spoke. No one moved. Because this time, he was alone. "You don't understand," Calloway tried again, voice tight. "This is political. A hit job. I have connections." "That's enough," the marshal said, taking a step forward. Calloway instinctively stepped back, bumping into his chair. He gripped the desk in front of him, as if clinging to the last shreds of his authority. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, I'm not doing this." The second marshal, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke. "Judge, you can walk out of here with dignity, or we can drag you out. Your choice." Calloway's hands trembled against the desk. His chest rose and fell too quickly. He was a man who had spent years controlling the fate of others with the swing of a gavel. And now, in an instant, he was just another defendant, another man who had to answer for his actions. J.D. Vance was still watching, silent. He had not spoken since the marshals entered. He didn't need to. The weight of what was happening was enough. A tense moment stretched between Calloway and the marshals. Then he moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but enough. He straightened his back, exhaled sharply through his nose, and turned. His hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles white, as he forced himself to remain composed. The marshal stepped behind him, pulling the cuffs from his belt. The sound of metal clicking open was deafening in the quiet room. Calloway squeezed his eyes shut. Then, click. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. A hush fell over the room, thick with disbelief. Even those who had seen it coming, the attorneys, the journalists, the clerks, sat frozen, as if waiting for someone to tell them this was all some elaborate trick. It wasn't. Calloway swallowed hard, shoulders tense. His head stayed high, but it was no longer arrogance keeping. It was defiance. The marshal placed a firm hand on his arm, guiding him toward the steps that led down from the bench. His footsteps echoed as he descended, not as a judge, but as a man in custody. For a fleeting second, his eyes flicked toward Vance. Vance met his gaze, steady, unmoved. Calloway looked away first. The gallery, the jury, the attorneys. Everyone watched as he was escorted down the aisle, past the rows of stunned faces, past the courtroom he had once ruled over. As he neared the exit, something slipped from his desk, his gavel. It clattered onto the floor with a dull, final thud. And Judge Robert Calloway walked out in handcuffs. His reign was over. The door swung shut behind Judge Calloway, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. No one moved at first. No one spoke. It was as if the courtroom itself needed a moment to process the downfall of the man who had once commanded it. J.D. Vance remained seated, his fingers tapped lightly against the table, slow, measured. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smirking, he was simply taking it in. The lead defense attorney, Mark Hendricks, exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he murmured under his breath, "didn't see that coming." His co-counsel let out a low chuckle, still staring at the door. "I did." Across the aisle, the plaintiff's attorney, the same one Calloway had dismissed earlier, straightened, her papers with an almost theatrical slowness. "I assume we're getting a new judge." A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the courtroom, tentative at first, but even that felt surreal. A judge had just been arrested, mid-trial. The court clerk, still somewhat dazed, finally regained her bearings and turned toward the remaining attorneys. "The court will reconvene once an alternate judge is assigned," she said, voice steadier than expected. People began shifting, in their seats, murmuring among themselves. Some attorneys exchanged glances, clearly wondering how this case would move forward. The jury looked lost, unsure of what to do, or even if they were supposed to stay. But the reporters, they were already at work. A cluster of them near the back furiously typed on their phones, sending out breaking news alerts. Others whispered into recorders, summarizing what they had just witnessed. One reporter, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense presence, turned to her colleague. "This isn't just a case anymore," she said under her breath. "This is history." Her colleague nodded. "Calloway's done." The gallery was still half full when J.D. Vance finally stood. He gathered his notes, nodding politely to his legal team, before turning toward the exit. As he walked down the aisle, people instinctively stepped aside. Some met his gaze, nodding with quiet respect. Others simply watched, taking in the man who had sat through a storm without flinching. A reporter caught up to him, just as he reached the hallway. "Senator Vance," she called. He stopped, turned slightly. "Yes?" She hesitated, then asked the question that was already circulating in the room. "Did you know this was coming?" Vance studied her for a moment, then allowed, himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Let's just say," he said, adjusting his watch, "justice has a way of catching up." Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving the courtroom and the memory of Judge Calloway's reign behind him. Power can be intoxicating. It can make people believe they are untouchable, that they can bend the rules, silence voices, and act without consequence. But the truth is, no one, not even those in the highest positions, can escape accountability forever. Judge Calloway ruled his courtroom with arrogance, believing he could twist justice to suit his own biases. He insulted, belittled, and silenced those he didn't agree with. But in the end, the law doesn't answer to egos. It answers to truth. And when corruption is exposed, the fall is always harder than the climb. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Because justice isn't just about laws, it's about people willing to stand up, even when the odds are against them.